today. This afternoon's webinar, organized by the WCO ESA Regional Private Sector Group, focuses on a very, very pertinent set of issues. We're looking at smart corridors and regional competitiveness. The aim is towards building an integrated logistics ecosystem in the ESA region. We're very honored to have three eminent speakers who have not only detailed technical knowledge, but also practical experience of the issues we're discussing this afternoon. You've had the privilege of seeing their bios a little bit earlier as you came in. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Jacob van Rensburg and Ms. Shikondine Sousa, and of course, Barbara Mommen, who all of them are well known to all of us. Now, the concept of smart corridors actually originates in the African context with the African Union's Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa, the PIDA. And they first defined this concept in 2016. So it goes back some time. But of course, in the last few years, this has gathered momentum as a solution to addressing many of the friction problems associated with bottlenecks along our corridors, delays at border posts, and many, many other challenges that erode competitiveness. Obviously, with tech developments, artificial intelligence, and much, much more to support these developments, we are now able to address many of the challenges which even a decade and a half ago would have posed significant challenges. We heard at our meeting this afternoon about some of the corridor developments, and it certainly is extremely important. This is extremely important for the achievement of the success of the African Continental Free Trade Area. But smart corridors and the kind of programs we're talking about are important for our overall competitiveness, irrespective of who we trade with. So they're important also to increase our competitiveness with our global trade partners. So we look very much forward to hearing our speakers, but also engaging in a conversation with them. We're going to start off with Jacob to make the first presentation, after which we'll have a short break to take some questions. And this gives us an opportunity to clarify any issues. We'll then move on to Shikondine and have a small break again, and then move on to Barbara. Colleagues, as always, use the chat function to post your questions. We will be monitoring that, and we can, of course, open for you to speak. But please make sure that you are muted. We'll ask our speakers to open their videos so we can see where they are and follow more easily. You may also find some poll questions perhaps coming through. And if you do, please do give us your feedback. This helps us to refine our agendas going forward and also to identify topics for future webinars. So without further ado from me, Jacob, I'm very pleased to hand over to you. It's very good to see you, and we look very much forward to your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Trudy, and good afternoon, colleagues. I'm dialing in from quite afar, so I've requested Tyrone to assist me with flighting the presentation. So thank you once again for this opportunity to present here today. As Trudy introduced me very kindly, my name is Jacob van Rensburg. I serve as the Head of Research and Development at the Southern African Association of Freight Forwarders, SAAFF, and of course the Executive Coordinator of the World Customs Organization, East and Southern Africa Regional Private Sector Group. So colleagues, today I'll be sharing a regional perspective on the key economic and logistical challenges facing the SADC region, 16 member countries. The research is focused on the SADC member countries. However, many of these are replicated throughout the rest of the ESA region and the 24 countries that comprises our region. I will not focus only on the challenges today, but also propose some strategic responses that we believe at SAAFF and the Regional Private Sector Group can shape more sustainable, inclusive outcomes for the entire region. This presentation is very much a macroeconomic view, focusing on the growth and development in the region, but also, as the title suggests, the logistical challenges. So in the next slide, I just cover quickly the key themes of this presentation. It is structured around these 6 that you see on your screen. And a lot of them are taken from various reports that we do on a weekly basis. From the Southern African Association of Freight Forwarders perspective, we author a weekly cargo movement report. And then also from the Regional Private Group's perspective, we author a weekly cross-border report that looks at the freight movements in our main corridors and our main region. And when we tackle the 3 pressing challenges I've listed here, is that there is most definitely a need for greater job creation. It's true in our region, we have a very big population, a growing one, a young one, and we do struggle with unemployment quite a bit. Then secondly, the imperative is to reduce the logistics cost. Most of the colleagues in this call, and indeed in our region, we are logisticians. We are involved in cross-border trade and transport and logistics. So that is a big need and drive for us from our side, is to reduce that cost. And then lastly, a challenge that is most pertinent, most definitely in our perspective in South Africa, but indeed the entire region. And that is the need to revitalize our regional rail system. And then lastly, I will offer some thoughts on the way forward. Some solutions, perhaps. We do not only want to be problem managers, but as well, most definitely drive some sustainable solutions. So a strategy that is built on collaboration, on data, and on an integrated investment plan. So colleagues, in the next slide, the SADC region. To provide a quick economic overview, the region, as we know, comprises of 16 member states with a combined population of only over 380 million people and growing, as I've mentioned in the opening remarks, a very young population. This regional bloc spans a vast geographic and developmental spectrum, from small islands economies to resource-rich inland states that are most definitely also constrained by being land-linked or landlocked, whichever concept or phrase you do prefer. Now, looking at the economic performance across these countries, they have most definitely currently been, and in the last couple of years, been mixed. On the one hand, we do see some very strong performance in countries like the DRC, Mauritius, Mozambique, and Zambia and Tanzania. All of these countries registering growth rates, and these are latest growth rates from 2023, consolidated, and more than 5% growth. And these countries are benefiting from, on the one part, commodity booms, structural reforms, and in some cases, improvements in political stability. But on the other hand, and not only for the growing countries, indeed for all of the countries in our region, several economies, such as notably in the southern region, Angola, Lesotho, South Africa, are struggling and growing at less than 2%, which is of course not sustainable for socio-economic growth and development. Structural constraints, high unemployment, policy uncertainty, and for us logisticians, especially infrastructure bottlenecks, are at the heart of these divergent growth figures. So trade patterns also tell a very compelling stories. Our economies remain overly dependent on raw material exports, especially in the central parts with limited local processing or beneficiation, so value add. And then also we can say that intra-SADC and indeed ESA and intra-African trade still accounts for less than 25% of the total trade, revealing a stark underdevelopment of regional value chains and corridors, and that number is especially low when compared to other trading blocs such as the ASEAN or the EU, where intra-regional trade often exceeds 50%. Of course, colleagues, we must be honest about macro risks. We have, in many of these countries, we have ballooning public debt, exchange rate forex, volatility, and underwhelming levels of foreign direct investment, FDI. And this is also particularly in the logistics intensive sectors. And these constraints, they pose ongoing threats to regional resilience and also investor confidence. So while these growth opportunities, and we can see them in some of these countries with the high growth rates, while they do exist, they are often uneven and vulnerable to global shocks. And global shocks we've indeed had over the last couple of months and years, starting 5 years ago with the COVID crisis, the pandemic, global supply chain shocks, not getting our goods to market and to our own domestic market. So, colleagues, in this context, modern, integrated and cost-effective logistics infrastructure is not a luxury. It is a prerequisite for long-term inclusive growth and socio-economic development. So in the next slide, let's shift our attention to logistics, particularly the structural features that shape the flow of goods across our region. On your screen, you can see the interplay between load, distance, and speed and their relationship. Over significant landmass areas such as our region, rail transport should, in theory, be preferred. However, it is a well-established fact that in our region and indeed in cross-border trade in Africa, road transport dominates the freight movement, accounting for approximately 80% of the trade volume. And this is largely due to the flexibility and the relative simplicity of road logistics. But unfortunately, colleagues, as we all know, they come at a very high cost. We are talking about a system that is economically inefficient over long distances, environmentally also unsustainably, and socially problematic due to road degeneration, congestion, and also, as the International Road Federation often tell us, various safety risks involved. So in short, our current logistics profile is not future fit for purpose. Moreover, the interaction between logistics and economic growth is mutually reinforcing. So poor logistics inflates the trade costs, as we know, which is very high, and I'll get to that in a later slide. It reduces our competitiveness and limits the flow of goods and services. And this is especially true for landlocked or landlocked countries, such as in our region, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, where unfortunately inefficient corridors act as a tax on trade, so to speak, and they bring very many non-tariff barriers. Our systems also operate across multiple scales, national, corridor, and regional, but without proper alignment, and often we see the results in fragmented infrastructure planning. There are some very encouraging projects, and I'll get to some of them in the rail space in our region later on, but unfortunately this is a very often a constraint to us. Inconsistent regulatory environments and redundant investments still curtail some growth in our logistics space. So what we need, colleagues, in our region is most definitely a strategic shift, both in the modal and the institutional space. Therefore, we must move from a reactive road-centric model to an integrated multimodal logistics system that prioritizes rail for the long-haul freight especially for bulk commodities. And we can think about the various countries and the commodities that we shift a lot of mining and agricultural focused economic activity. They need rail to play its rightful place. It's not to say that we are pitting the one modality, road transport, against rail, but rather to have a multimodal, intramodal, in fact, is the correct term, approach to satisfying our very large logistics demand, which is currently the case in our region. So the time has really come to realign our infrastructure planning from a public space and our policy frameworks with this imperative to get this interplay that you see on your screen, load, distance, speed, and the relationship together to play its rightful part. Colleagues, on the next slide, and I am a big fan of this slide, it shows the relationship between economic growth and development, trade, supply chains and corridors, and of course, the very important role that logistics play in driving socio-economic growth and development. So on the left-hand side on your screen, we have a funnel which shows the socio-economic growth and development top-down and logistics bottom-up. And colleagues, it is internationally a well explicitly governed fact that efficient logistics is a critical factor in socio-economic development. And then, of course, socio-economic development is highly dependent on sustained economic growth, something that is, as I showed earlier, quite lacking in some of the countries in this region. Moreover, international trade is a significant driver of economic growth and development. Indeed, for South Africa, but for many countries in our region, trade as a composite of imports and exports is more than 50 to 60% of global GDP in each of these countries and indeed in the entire world. And for trade to run smoothly, it requires the effective functioning of global value chains and participation in these supply chains and corridor developments. And that is very key for our region. It is true for most countries. It is certainly true for our region, is that improved logistics performance, the vehicle of trade, increases the efficiency in trading by reducing the time and cost to trade, which could then result in an increase in the volume of trade, more participation in value chains, and ultimately which will spill over into economic growth and socio-economic development, some aspects that are very important for our region. And this relationship between efficient logistics and socio-economic growth and development is widely accepted from national policy makers in the public space to multilateral agencies, IMF, World Bank, and the like, and economic actors, mostly the people in this room, if I look at the participants in this webinar, and the logistics service providers. So there is most definitely, in summary, a direct positive circular relationship between the concepts that you see on your left-hand side. Then on your right-hand side, and I like this figure as well very much, is that it shows that logistics systems, they operate at different intersecting and or aggregating organizational and geographical levels, encompassing all the critical actors, the people in this room, the actors in our logistics network. And at a very most basic level, at a micro level, logistics is as simple as an individual consumer ordering a product online sourced locally. You can think about your Uber Eats or a local delivery from the pharmacy, for instance. And then at the very macro scale, at the most complex, a logistics system encompasses all the actors at all geographic levels. And now it's very important to note in our space that firms, they represent a dominant actor in the system, and as such are the consumers of logistics. And indeed, it's very important to distinguish between logistics users, so logistics demand players, and logistics supply chain actors, the producers and providers of logistics and infrastructures and spatial development and geographical connectivity. So in most cases, users, they include all of the role players, both public and private, which will relate to shippers, carriers, freight forwarders, customs clearing agents and brokers, terminal operators, etc. Whereas providers of logistics include national infrastructure, roads, ports, airports, etc., and other related spatial connectivity. And now why I put this slide in this presentation is that these considerations are key, as national logistics systems are the providers of infrastructure and spatial connectivity, whereas the business logistics systems are the users. So in the next slide, colleagues, to the challenges presented here today, and the number one in our region in terms of our logistics and socio-economic growth and development challenge is most definitely job creation. High unemployment continues to plague much of the ESA region. For instance, in Eswatini and South Africa, unemployment rates currently exceed 30%, with youth unemployment particularly severe, which is very much a challenging aspect in our region. I have tabled on your screen a summary of what the literature says about increasing employment in various sectors in the region. But of course, we will focus on logistics, which hold enormous potential as a job-creating engine. Logistics, of course, colleagues, is not merely about moving goods. It's about enabling production. It's about facilitating trade. It's about facilitating the services that people provide and demand. And most definitely logistics, as we often say in our space, it's a growth multiplier that touches multiple sectors. Manufacturing, retail, agricultural, e-commerce, that is growing a lot in our screen, in our space. And the data from Agenda 2063's modeling is instructive. Investment in education, infrastructure, and especially in our region, we've seen also a lot of digitalization have the potential to lift many of the people currently unemployed out of poverty. Logistics sit most definitely at the intersection of all of these aspects and industries. And we've seen a massive increase in digital logistics, which offers high potential pathways for youth employment. Whether through, think about aspects like fleet management, warehouse automation, data analysis, e-commerce, as I've mentioned in our space. So these sectors, they are most definitely, especially with the increase of the utilization of artificial intelligence and machine learning, they require new skills, different skills, but they also enable rapid employment scale up for our industry. Therefore, it's very important, most definitely for the logistics industry, to promote regional skills alignment, perhaps through cross-border training centers. We must most definitely encourage employment-friendly logistics policies, such as support for SMMEs in warehousing and last mile services. Think about the fact that trade in our space is situated most definitely and concentrated in SMMEs. I think the number is about 80% of trade in Africa takes form in the form of SMMEs and smaller entities conducting these trade and transport initiatives. And then, of course, from a public sector perspective, we must ensure that the infrastructure development is inclusive, connecting the rural areas, of which we have a lot in Africa, in our region, and the small enterprises, and allow them to participate in the trade corridor developments and activities. So in short, to summarize this challenge, is that logistics must not only be seen as an economic input, but as a critical social output. And if we design and govern our logistics network well, it can most definitely make a significant dent in our unemployment challenge, which is challenge number one in our industry. On to challenge number two, lowering national and regional logistics cost, which is a very important thing in our region. In the ESA region, we have some of the highest logistics costs in the world, ranging between 20 and as much as 60% of the landed cost of a product. And this, colleagues, is in a stark contrast to the rest of the OECD economies and the rest of the developed world, where logistics costs are typically below 10% of the cost of goods. And of course, colleagues, the reasons to the high national and regional logistics costs are very well known. Delays at border posts and terminals, informal payments and non-tariff barriers, poor road conditions. Of course, road is the dominant modality in our region, and inadequate infrastructure. And of course, as I've mentioned, a lack of comprehensive rail alternative. The fact that we must choose road transport as the preferred modality. Then perhaps we can also look at inefficient fleet utilization due to empty backhauls or poor coordination, which is very prevalent in our region. So these costs are not only borne by the logistics service providers, most of the colleagues in this room, but they are unfortunately passed down to the producers, the exporters, and ultimately to the end consumer. And one of the most effective ways to address this is through data. It's something at the heart of every day of my work, but also of the rest of the regional private sector group. And what we do is to look into corridor performance monitoring systems that can shine light on the inefficiencies and where these bottlenecks occur, and to help governments and operators track progress over time. We can, of course, use data to look into cross-border harmonization of standards, something very important in our region, and looking as well at the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and look at alignment of these standards in coordinating the axle load limits and the clearance protocols and the various other customs procedures to reduce the administrative friction that we often find in trade, transport, and logistics in our region. And of course, investment in way breach bypasses, electronic pre-clearance, regional cargo visibility, removal in bond processes, and all of these other platforms that can reduce the time and the cost to do business in our region significantly. And with all of these, as I mentioned earlier, there's a most definite touch of logistics on all of these factors. And ultimately, logistics must be treated as a strategic asset, not as a sunken cost. That is often the case in our region and the rest of the world. And therefore, logistics efficiency should be seen as a proxy for the rest of the economy and as a marker of the economic health in our region. The last challenge, before we get to some solutions in the next slide, is the rail system in our region. And unfortunately, colleagues, the decline of the rail system, if we move to the next slide, across the region, is one of the most pressing but under-discussed challenges in our regional development. It's curious to note, colleagues, that the SADC region has about 60,000 kilometers of track, of which around half of that is in South Africa. However, rail's market share has dropped dramatically from around 50% of the total trade in the 1980s to below 15% in most countries in our region today. And why is that? Several main challenges or reasons. Because of that, it has been the chronic underinvestment in the rail industry in our region. Also, the state-owned monopolies with limited capacity to innovate, and a lack of interoperability between the systems across borders. And unfortunately, revenue decline is both a cause and a consequence. Low market share results in poor service, which in turn then further reduces the demand of rail. But colleagues, there is hope. Targeted actions can revitalize the sector. Regulatory reform, something that we see most definitely in South Africa currently, such as opening the access regimes and linking performance to concessioning agreements, can attract private investment, something that's very much required in the rail space in our region. And then, of course, regional integration of planning and of operations can ensure better alignment between the corridors and the terminal. And of course, colleagues, investment in key routes, such as recently the Lobito and Beira corridors through public-private participation or blended finance can yield quick wins. So rail is not only the mode capable of absorbing long-haul freight cost effectively, without it, the rail network also continue to degrade. Emissions rise and we will miss out on a key enabler of regional integration. And as I've mentioned with that interplay slide and image, it's not one modality over the other, but it's most definitely the interplay and the complementary interplay between the road and the rail freight. So colleagues, on the next slide, let me briefly touch on 3 strategic projects and give you some feedback that represent progress and potential in our region in terms of some rail infrastructure currently underway. And first is the Ponta Techobanine railway line, which is a 1,700 kilometer corridor linking Botswana and Zimbabwe to Mozambique's coast. Estimated at $6.5 billion, this project will provide landlocked countries with a direct access to the Indian Ocean, enhancing mineral exports specifically and reducing the freight rail costs. Secondly, also very encouraging, has been the Tanzania-Burundi standard railway gauge that is currently under construction, which will connect Burundi to Dar es Salaam via a 367 kilometer line. At a cost of about 2.15 billion, it promises to unlock Burundi's mineral exports and to enhance regional integration. Burundi, of course, also a landlocked country. Then third, the Tazara railway upgrade under a 30-year concession will hopefully inject $1.4 billion into the aging Tanzania-Zambia line with various infrastructure upgrades and new rolling stock to restore capacity, safety and reliability. These projects, along with other freight villages and multimodal integration systems, can most definitely change the logistics landscape in SADC and signal that rail is back on the agenda and serve as a very important enabler for trade, investment and growth. So in the next slide, and colleagues, I'm getting to the end of this presentation, is perhaps a call to action. What is needed to bring all of these aspects together? So first, something that's at the heart of all of the work that we do on a daily basis is the need to adopt a scientific, data-driven approach to regional logistics. Too often, we see, colleagues, that decisions are made without evidence or are driven by political consideration, something that's very apparent in our region. But of course, data analytics can guide smarter investment and better operational choices for logistics in our region. Then secondly, we must embrace regionalism in practice, not just on paper. Currently, SADC protocols exist, but implementation is often inconsistent. So therefore, a regional logistics strategy grounded in practical collaboration is most definitely for our region long overdue. Then third, we need to prioritize investment-based activity on economic impact. Corridors that move the most cargo or connect the most economically active zones, they must come first. And we have many key corridors in our region. Because, colleagues, quite frankly, fragmentation is expensive. The end consumer will pay. Finally, public and private sectors must work together. Industry knows where the pain points are, but too often the public sector and the government, they do not create that enabling environment for us to trade. And in all of this, logistics is the bloodstream of regional development. Therefore, we cannot afford any blockages any longer. I've mentioned investment, I've mentioned collaboration, but indeed all of us must take that responsibility. And in that, I want to end on somewhat of a highlight, focusing on the AfCFTA. In the next slide, I've just listed some of the key aspects of the AfCFTA. I know it really our chair, and many of the other colleagues in this room are very active in promoting and collaborating on the AfCFTA, but it's most definitely absolutely key and a once in a generation, at least for us, opportunity to unlock economic growth and development. The continent, indeed, our entire space, we have more than 1.3 billion people and a projected GDP of $3.4 trillion. And the AfCFTA has the potential to boost intra-African trade by more than 50%. As I mentioned earlier, other regions such as the EU, the Asian countries, intra-regional trade is more than 50% of the trade basket, which shows you a significant area for us in a regional space to improve. So we must promote this once in a lifetime agreement. We must promote export diversification, drive industrialization across the continent, and get to value added beneficiation for our industries. In the next slide, I show that, the promise of the AfCFTA will not materialize without functioning logistics systems, and markets can only integrate if goods can move quicker, they can move better, they can move cheaper, and most definitely also tariff reductions are meaningless if containers sit idle at congested borders or if transport costs make goods trade unviable. So that's why these issues we've discussed today, they are not only peripheral, they are foundational, they touch our daily business. So let me conclude by saying that the ESA region has the raw potential, the demographics, a young population, the geographic and economic potential to become a global growth zone, whereby all of the countries can hopefully grow at 8%, not only some of them. But we must act decisively on logistics. So therefore, it's a call to action. It's time for coordination, innovation, and investment, and the time is now. Colleagues, thank you very much for this opportunity. That's the end of my presentation. I hand back to Trudy. Thank you very much.
Jacob, thank you so much for this very rich presentation. We just started off in SADC, taken us through ESA, and you've ended on a very positive note with the AfCFTA. I think some of the data you've shared with us is a bit of a wake-up call in terms of what needs to be done on the continent and how important logistics is. It's important for trade, but also for Africa's industrialization. As you've mentioned, the value chain developments also depend on moving goods, inputs, intermediates across borders. Colleagues, we have a few minutes for questions for Jacob before we move on to our next presenter. Tyrone, you'll help me check for hands as they come up. And also, of course, we've asked colleagues to put questions and comments in the chat room. I don't see any there right now, but any quick question for clarification or comment? I see Nico raised your hand. Nico, please go ahead.
Thank you, Trudy. Jacob, good day to you as well. I think mine is type of a question or a statement, but more of a question in my mind is that what impact does the informal trade have on our borders and infrastructure at the moment? Does it, I would think it's got a negative impact because it's not as controlled as it should be. And even for that informal trade, which leads over to SMEs, it might reduce their logistics costs. So if you could just maybe make a comment or share some insight on that for me, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nico, and that's a very pertinent question or statement, as you've alluded to. I think it's very important to realize that in Africa, especially on the periphery, so outside of these corridors, we have a lot of informal trade. And it's quite curious, there has been some discussions and indeed critique about, let's call them the Eurocentric kind of approach to capturing data, such as GDP. in that in Africa, a lot of the economic activity is not captured in that figure because of things like informal trade and unstructured, I think is the correct World Bank type of topic or a phrase to this kind of unstructured trade. But it's very important to note, and speaking to some of your transporters and perhaps your truck drivers in the region, they will give you some feedback in terms of just the role that the informal trade has on logistics in cross-border trade, especially on the road modality movement. I think there are areas whereby a lot of activity is addition to the structured trade, but they are sometimes in kind of benefit, but other times not so much, in the fact that they also put constraints on logistics and transport. I've mentioned the fact that in regional trade in Africa, and this is across modalities, it's not only on the road transport, but also on the ocean freight transport, is that often the case is that there is not a return load in the cargo. So therefore, invariably, that adds logistics cost to doing business across borders. And it's not really because of unstructured trade, but it's the fact that there is simply not that economic demand because of the fact that there is no demand, but as well that there is not that level of participation into these main corridors. So it's a very curious thing to note, and I think that's some of the developmental that is as a layer under the economic agenda of the AfCFTA is to get the African population outside or in the periphery of these main trade corridors to get involved in the economic activity that's currently taking place in that. So it's both a challenge, so to speak, but also a significant opportunity. And that's why I highlighted the fact that the uptake of technology, the participation in, and we often talk about things like AI and machine learning and things that are like that, very much at the high end of development, but digitalization and just basically giving all economic actors in the region in Africa just the opportunity to have a cell phone, to be able to call and to email and to take place or take part in the economic market and space in the region is a significant growth enabler of not only the economic side but also the socio development side in our region. So it's really on all of us and on the entire continent and its policy makers to ensure that we up that digital activity in the continent as well and get people involved in doing business. As I mentioned earlier, trade is a significant contributor to something like economic growth and development. More than 60% of GDP globally is in trading goods and services. So it is a key enabler for the continent as it is for each and every country, indeed. And I hope in that sense, a very long-winded answer, but I've given you some satisfactory feedback in terms of getting the unstructured trade to participate and more of a structured approach in terms of doing business across border. Thank you for that question, Nico. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for that response. It's now my pleasure to ask Shikonde to make her presentation. Colleagues, many of us know her from the SADC Secretariat, where she's the Senior Program Officer on Transport in the Infrastructure Directorate. And we're going to hear now about the North-South Corridor, the pilot, so smart economic corridor development in the context of this corridor that we know so much about already. Shikonde, over to you. And do you need to share presentation or will Tyrone assist? Shikonde, can you hear us? Tyrone, do you see Shikonde with us?
I don't see her in the room unless she's
Okay.
joined with someone else's device.
That could well be, but I'm not hearing a response. In that case, in the interest of time, colleagues, I'd like to invite Barbara Mommen, who of course is extremely well known to all of us with many, many years of practical experience in corridor development, facilitation. And I certainly remember, Barbara, a lot of your excellent work related to the Maputo Development Corridor. So it's a great pleasure to ask you to make your presentation. Please do go ahead.
Thank you so much, Trudy. I'm trying to share, but I'm battling to find my presentation. So let me just see, and I'll put my camera on so you can be punished with my ragged look at this time of the day. I don't know why I can't seem to find the presentation that I have. Sorry. Is that? No, that's not what we need. Can you see my window at least?
We see a window, definitely, yes.
Okay, can you see that?
No presentation, just a blank screen at the moment.
Sorry, let me try again. There we go. Should work now. My apologies for that. Right.
This is excellent. Thanks, Barbara. We're in
Great.
business.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much to the PSCG for the invitation to discuss building competitive trade and transport corridors in the region. It's not an easy discussion. So I've learned something. I didn't think that learning could be quite so rough and tumble as it has been for me. I'm in the process of qualifying as a dressage judge. And one of the things that they really insist on is that you don't criticize the rider or the horse, but that you give a positive input as far as possible while pointing out the problems. So with that challenge in mind, I decided to take that approach with the corridors. So what I'm going to do is just show you that what we, sorry, my mouse is so tetchy. We're going to mostly focus on North-South corridor, the Northern corridor, the Central corridor, Maputo corridor, and the Walvis Bay corridor. I know that these are only a few of the corridors in the region, but I think they're the ones that we are most familiar with in terms of the issues. And I'm going to deal with two particular issues. Number one is the one I've just asked, which corridors are considered. And then I'm going to look at 13 factors fundamental to trade and transport corridors. Now, while these factors are probably all well known, I didn't want to repeat what Jacob was discussing. And I am going to look at it broadly. If necessary, I will provide examples where there are physical examples of the discussion. So the key factors that we are looking at today is for cross-border competitiveness. And there are 13 of these. The first is that we need efficient, predictable, and you'll see that word quite often during the presentation, predictable and transparent border procedures. And in the studies that I looked at, it seems to be the single strongest determinant of corridor competitiveness is how predictable, how efficient, and how visible these border procedures are. And it deals entirely with the big issues for logistics service providers: efficiency, cost, quality, and speed. So you need fast, reliable clearance times. You need risk-based inspections and reduced physical checks. We've seen many of these physical checks, especially in My apologies for the nonsense going on behind me. We've seen a lot of these checkpoints reduced, particularly in West Africa, which is as a result of concerted efforts by stakeholders, and then especially the one-stop border posts. And what we really need is, and I've called it in my notes, genuinely joint operations, because there are examples where one-stop border posts have not been genuinely joint operations. And then coordination of the border management across customs, immigration, the security, and all the agencies that are involved in the border, cross-border picture. And then the transparency of the workflows, the automated workflows, even if there are, and I think there are few that are still completely manual, but what is critical, and it's something that we talk about all the time, is digitization. Minimal human intervention is absolutely critical, because that is where most often the issues arise. So if we look at the second issue, and none of these are really in any way a prioritized order, but as they came to mind. So without really good, reliable, and well-maintained transport infrastructure, we really are going to struggle to get competitive efficiencies, competitive pricing, competitive logistics services into our continent and into our global supply chains. And the quality of infrastructure is directly involved and impacts the efficiency of the logistics costs and transit times. And in fact, what I think in the latest FTW, or one of the recent ones, there was a discussion around this, that the non-tariff barriers, which include infrastructure challenges, are what are the issues at borders. And I really want to say that if we look at corridors like the Maputo corridor, which was built on a massive infrastructure program, that infrastructure is still being serviced and maintained, and some of it is still inadequate, even though it is probably the busiest border post, I think, certainly in Southern Africa. And we have massive challenges around maintaining infrastructure elsewhere. I think the North-South corridor also has critical challenges around maintenance of transport infrastructure. So, and this is railroad, port terminals, and something we don't often talk about in this. I know that I'm supposed to talk about transport corridors, but air connectivity has raised its head frequently in recent years. This includes very simple things as we see it: adequate border facilities, adequate parking, scanners, adequate ICT capacity, and delineation of parking. Simple things like which lanes, and indications and signs saying what lanes, what parking is available for cargo. Then in terms of maintenance and retaining the value of our infrastructure, way bridges with enforcement integrity. I know that this is an issue continent-wide, where there is seldom a sort of free of loopholes process as far as way bridges are concerned, which is why Way in Motion has become such a hot topic as well. Infrastructure doesn't only talk about road and rail, but it also looks at warehousing, at cold chain, at the availability of depots and distribution nodes that are also serviced by connecting infrastructure. And I think we mustn't downplay the absolute importance for ports of landside infrastructure that can service the cargo terminals. if we look at now I can't get it to move at all. So the third issue is the need for, again, this word predictable, low cost transport and logistics. Competitive pricing for transport, for fuel, for warehousing, port services, for toll roads, all of these issues have become a major factor in people deciding which ports and which corridors to use. Predictability and affordability is what allows exporters to compete regionally and globally. And this is never more true than if we are going to look more closely at the AfCFTA and the benefits that corridors will have for that implementation. Just on the issue of costs, I'm not dealing with corruption as a sort of major topic, but you will see that there is a thread through my presentation that addresses the fact that corruption on our continent is a major factor that affects the predictability, low costs, and the efficiency. So the absence, or in the ideal world, the absence of unofficial payments, extortion, and illegal roadblocks is absolutely essential. I think on the Maputo corridor, we've seen some drastically objectionable, is probably the right word, practices where traffic police have let down tires, have assaulted drivers, have even shot at drivers. Certainly not part of their mandate as law enforcement officers, but these kinds of incidents really do cost the supply chain an enormous amount. And I say it probably with monotonous regularity that it's not the cargo owner or the transporter that in fact bears that cost. It is the person who is buying the goods at the end of the supply chain. And on a continent where we have so many poor people and so many who are marginalized, it is critically important that we deal with that. So I didn't dedicate a slide to it, but I perhaps should have. So let's have a look at the next thing. Predictable transit times. And again, this issue of reliability, predictability, reliability, and efficiency has always been my sort of mantra on corridors. But if we look at this, transit times are really, particularly on road, and in some sense also for rail, is critical to ensuring that the costs are lowered. Although, if you look at the subtext there, predictability is greater than speed. In fact, as a universal finding in corridor performance studies, they say that cargo owners and transporters would look more often at predictability than speed as a factor for choosing a port or an export point. So this addresses things like the delays at borders, the ports, the dwell times at ports, weighbridges, and checkpoints. And then consistent scheduling for ports, the rail haulage, and evacuating cargo. Those things also need to be predictable and to a large extent reliable and transparent. Then we're also looking for limited disruption and absolutely minimal variable. I'm so sorry about the noise. Just going to put my apologies. We need really minimal variability in journey times, because this is really how we reduce costs and increase the credibility, reliability, predictability, and efficiencies. The safety factor is a major issue in predictability and corridor reliability. safe parking with the low risk of cargo theft, with proper rest stops and truck stops, because logistics supply chains actually plan around reliability. And even if it is slightly slower, the reliability is in fact what enables so many transporters and cargo owners to make a living on the corridors. You cannot plan around an unpredictable system. So, number 5, strong, harmonized, and business-friendly regulations. Here, regulatory incompatibility or friction remains, I think, certainly where you have many countries on a corridor, it remains one of the biggest barriers to trade efficiency and competitiveness. And in this, we certainly need greater transparency in terms of information shared to users of corridors of what the regulatory compliance is required. Aligning standards and documentation is certainly something that the TTFP has managed to address quite effectively. And I think one of the things that we should look at, certainly within Southern Africa, is how we can use the fuel supply chain as a pilot for the CTMS, because I think that is one of the areas where we have a lot of corrupt activity and quite a bit of cheating along the way, and certainly very challenging circumstances for a lot of the customs agencies. Also, we've seen in some cases simplified permits, transit bonds, and documentary requirements, and certainly what has happened on the Maputo corridor with the current position is the pre-clearing and the need for an upfront permit before you're allowed to even access the bypass to leave the country. What we haven't got is an agreement even within the SADC member states, the rules for axle loads, for safety, for hazardous equipment, hazardous cargo, and certain of the enforcement regulations which change. These present often non-tariff barriers and are certainly something that I think could be addressed more effectively through institutional arrangements on the corridors. Unfortunately, we don't have institutions on all of the corridors in Africa. It would be impossible. And I think that there is a move towards a greater flexibility around these institutional arrangements, but it's critical that whatever institutions are put in place, that they're collecting data, that they're providing information, that they're also supporting that transparency that is required for the users of corridors. If we look at the 6th point, it is the great technology and digitalization system that everybody longs for. It is actually the most powerful tool for reducing delays and for reducing corruption, simply because of the fact that it removes the human factor, which is the tricky factor, the necessary but often tricky factor where cross-border trade is concerned. Please, if I sound derogatory, it is certainly not meant to be offensive. It's 20 years of experience on corridors, where quite frequently the lack of digitalization and lack of technological capacity has caused enormous issues for trade. So the customs single window is, in my view, the way that we should go. I know that it is challenging for many of the customs agencies, but is critical if we are to move specifically into the the sweet spot of the AfCFTA. That is probably going to be, in my very uninformed opinion, one of the biggest challenges of the AfCFTA, to get that single window function at every border post. Pre-arrival processing, electronic cargo tracking, and digital manifests, all of these things are underway to various degrees in many of these corridors. I've spoken a little about the way in motion for way bridges, the scanning and the payment systems. We certainly have seen an uptick in electronic payments for many of the services, although this is still not entirely smooth, and it's still not entirely applicable across the corridors. And I think one of the things that we certainly struggle with in Southern Africa is the information sharing across customs organizations. So the memorandums of agreement that have been signed, and the need for a proper integrated system for corridor countries is absolutely urgent. We still struggle to really find the information we need when moving goods from one country to another. And I think in terms of digitization, one of the key factors for every single corridor is the data analytics for performance monitoring. And this can also work very effectively for early problem detection and to address those so that they don't become massive big technical or non-tariff barriers. Reduced corruption, reduced discretionary and informal payments. I think this is a reality on every single corridor. And unfortunately, where there is, and I can't say that this is a strictly scientific research factor, but just it's sort of based on on informal discussions had with stakeholders on various corridors, is that where there is not an institution that services the corridor, such as the Central Corridor, the Northern Corridor, the Walvis Bay Corridor, these informal payments certainly are more regular. So the integrity of systems in customs, the police and the border agencies, absolutely critical. And I think one thing that we tend to underestimate is the elimination, or the need to eliminate, the sort of off-system processing and cash handling, where this becomes an issue, where drivers have to carry cash to pay for things. This becomes a major factor. So, as the subtitle says, corruption is one of the top predictors of weak competitiveness. And this continent has so much to gain if this issue is dealt with effectively. On the effective regional integration and institutional coordination and alignment, we really don't always have a picture of the implementation, or the full implementation, of regional trade protocols. And I think it's because it kind of sits in the regulatory framework area, where sometimes this is not entirely clear. What's there is not entirely clear to users of corridors until they come up against an issue. So we need mutual recognition of certificates, standards, inspections, all of those things, joint border operations, integrated corridor management institutions, regional dispute resolution and performance monitoring is absolutely essential. And I think the TTFP's approach with the CTMS is also going to assist enormously with supporting that. Corridors only work if countries cooperate. And in the case of the Maputo corridor, we've had probably 6 7, maybe even 8 years, where the necessary bilaterals addressing corridor issues specifically have not taken place. Now that the BMA, the Border Management Agency, has been put in place in South Africa, we've seen some improvement in those bilaterals. And I can't emphasize strongly enough how unilateral reform is insufficient, because really what it does is it eliminates your partners. And quite often what we experienced in the Maputo corridor was that you had, from one day to the next, a new law or some sort of new arrangement or agreement implemented without ever informing the users of the corridor. And that used to cause enormous delays, enormous issues, and a great deal of dissatisfaction all around. So if we look at the 9th factor, competitive, professional logistics and transport services. And I think what we underestimate the importance of training and capacity building in the logistics and transport services sector. Skilled transporters, skilled freight forwarders, clearing and forwarding agents, the availability of skilled cold chain warehousing and multimodal management, the encouragement of private sector investments in logistics infrastructure really depends on the ability of the sector to have capacity to deal with that at a professional level. And I think our industry associations are absolutely essential for strengthening this and providing the service quality that's required. Then we're getting to sort of to the end: strong institutions, strong governance, and strong accountability. And I can't emphasize enough how efficient, well-funded institutions, whether they're non-profit or whether they're state-owned entities, are absolutely essential for ensuring that corridors run effectively. This extends to customs administrations and ports. And I think, again, if we're looking at governance and accountability, the data-driven scorecards and monitoring systems are absolutely crucial. And we need, I think, even in the corridors that exist, a greater level of institutional capacity for planning, regulation, and more than anything, the implementation of policy. I think there is where there's an enormous gap, and institutions that are credible, that have a known record of integrity, are able to provide that oversight and mechanisms that can prevent misconduct and can enforce those standards. I know that I'm speaking broadly, but I think in view of the sort of ESA region, I think it's important that we do that. The next is inclusivity and fair market access for small traders. I was going to put my hand up and comment on the question around informal trade. And I'm going to just use this particular little gap to say that we must never underestimate the value of informal trade. I know that it is seen as a pain in the butt most of the time, because informal traders go where they know they're going to get the custom. And I think my experience, certainly on the Maputo corridor and driving frequently, weekly in fact, from either Nelspruit or Johannesburg into Maputo, and seeing women, the same women, week after week after week, who are selling the same things week after week after week, are obviously there because they are putting clothes on their children's backs, putting food on the table, and ensuring that their children can go to school. And I know that informal trade, there has been an enormous number of studies done on informal trade, but the value is I think what governments really find difficult is that they're under the radar as far as the tax income is concerned. But what is absolutely essential is that we have this inclusivity, in terms of expanding opportunities for those people who do not have access to the formal corridor transport and logistics economy. And it strengthens regional economies. If you are dealing, even if it is on a hand-to-mouth basis, if you're able to put children through school and feed them every day, I think that is an essential item. Not easy for corridors and for very congested border posts, but I think we are certainly moving in the right direction with the support for access to finance and access to assistance for informal traders on corridors. So here, this point, the access to finance and investment in infrastructure, it may seem duplicative, but I think what we're looking at here is not only the transport infrastructure, but investment infrastructure, availability of trade finance, the availability of insurance products, and the availability, of the guarantees that are needed. These cut across all sectors, whether it's informal, small, medium, and large businesses, or even micro enterprises. The major factor is, and often comes up in discussion, is how access to finance is absolutely critical for trade, because of quite often the unpredictability and the need to provide as fast a service as possible. When we look at the public-private investment in roads, ports, and logistics centres and ICT, that investment in infrastructure is most often gained where corridors prove their credibility through the institutional arrangements, through the governance, through the ability to manage trade in an effective way. And here it's very important that fleet upgrades, the warehousing, and the cross-border SMEs are able to access finance to improve their ability to trade. And then the 13th one, I've sort of added this on because I think, in my experience, what happens is that governments make decisions and implement them quite frequently, and not always, but quite frequently without sufficient communication with the users of the corridor. And this is fairly simple to fix because there are many, many associations and organizations that work in all of the departments, in all of the sectors that a corridor service. And I think something that is overlooked quite frequently is the value of communication. As one of the previous CEOs of the track N4 road corridors always used to say, you can never over communicate. And it's very predictable that I repeat that, but I think it's a very true and very simple way of addressing some of the complexity in cross-border trade. So I end with this: political will and multi-level proactive interventions will greatly enable trade and transport corridor competitiveness. Thank you very much, and I'll happily take questions. Thank you, Trudy.
Barbara, thank you so much, as always, for an extremely rich and comprehensive overview dealing with the very practical issues, but also the policy, legal, and institutional issues, and for linking in the finance. And I think more and more we are recognizing the role of looking at an interconnected regional integration agenda. And of course, this we see in the African Continental Free Trade Area, where the focus, for example, in the protocol on women and youth, to address but that will be done through the trade and services agenda, but also through domestic initiatives as governments take a look at what can be done by development banks, but also by the commercial banking sector to address these deficits. So for me, you've raised so many important issues. Colleagues, any questions for Barbara? And I'm very pleased to announce that Chikonde has joined us, so we still have one more presentation. Any questions for Barbara? I see Nico. Nico, please go ahead.
I hope I'm not the only one asking questions or making statements today. Barbara, I think to add on to what Trudy said, thank you very much for an excellent experience-based presentation. I think your insights into what truly drives corridor efficiency and predictability were spot on. But listening to both you and Jacob, the question that naturally arises with all these requirements, credibility, safety, routing, scheduling, reliability, and all the questions and ingredients, if I can call it that, I think as the East and Southern African region, we must actually understand who are we competing with. We are, there's a competition on the different corridors, but I think in essence we should understand that we're not competing as neighbors. Our competition currently is Latin America, Australia, Southeast Asia, where minerals and bulk commodities move through a highly integrated, predictable, cost-efficient corridor with lots of investments. And I think that we need to understand that, and we need to find the solution. And you've listed all those ingredients, and it's critical that I think all the stakeholders in this region should understand what you were presenting. So, as I said, it's more than a statement, it's a question, but the ingredients that you've raised, and I look at the informal payments, and you use such nice words for these kind of things. But the point is, these are the things that make us uncompetitive. And I think, we can take a lot from what you presented. And I do thank you again for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, thank you. I think just to a follow-up comment, this issue of who's competing against who is a very layered issue, because it depends what you're looking at. Is it countries trying to make the best of their regional positives? Can they collaborate sufficiently? I don't think we've got there yet. And I think regional integration has been on the AU's agenda for probably 50, 60 years, if not more. And countries don't easily integrate and work together. And I know that this is also a predictable comment from me, but I think one of the values of corridor institutions is that they're a great enabler for understanding integration and regional integration, and enabling regional integration to actually be physically implemented. And then once that is in place, there is certainly an easier road to dealing with who we're competing against. But it's very layered. It's because supply chains compete. So do corridors, so do ports. And as I say, very layered. But you're absolutely right. In Africa, if we are going to get the AfCFTA working, there's a huge role for corridor institutions in facilitating and enabling the right kind of dialogue and the right information so that people know what they're able to do and how they're able to do it. And I think that's probably a critical factor that we sort of miss in a lot of the discussions that we have. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Barbara. I'm very pleased to acknowledge Washington Dube. Washington, thanks so much for joining us. You have a question? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Trudy. Thank you, Barbara, for I joined midway, but what I had very insightful indeed. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask Barbara that when you look at it, we've been like you point out that the issue of regional integration has been on the books for 50, 60 years. If one were to, maybe if I were to ask, what would be your solution, Barbara? I mean, maybe the major challenge, just one major challenge which makes African governments, as it were, not to be regionally interconnected. And also, if you were to be, maybe to be asked in a corner, what would be the most important solution to ensure that we are integrated as maybe specifically as the ESA region? The major challenges which is making us not to be integrated, and what will be your maybe a one solution which you feel that will pull us towards regional integration? I submit, Chair.
Thank you, Washington. A very good question. So I don't think I'm going to be popular for saying this, but I think the private sector has a massively important role in ensuring that regional integration happens, and they do it naturally. But one of the things that is required is for greater strength of lobbying capacity in private sector. I know that it's difficult unless you've got apex organizations that are really effective in countries, and that those apex organizations are not related in any way or associated in any way with the government. I'm not saying they mustn't work with the government, but there are countries where the apex organizations are actually legislated or recommended by government, and so are their chairpersons or their boards of directors, and that kind of, in my view, defeats the object. So there has to be a greater ability of private sector to really speak to the people that matter in government. And I know that it happens, but it doesn't happen around the specifics that regional integration is attempting to achieve. And I think one of those key factors is certainly being helped by the TTFP, where the tripartite is looking at the integration of legislation, of all kinds of the difficulties that have been affecting cross-border trade. And I think we're scared of dialogue, we're scared of disagreeing, but I honestly think that we've reached a point where in Africa we can't pretend that we can go on as we always have and expect different results. I know it makes it sound as though there's been no progress, and I'm certainly not saying that at all. But I think we are really not serving our populations, particularly the poor populations and the poor who have no access and no voice, where if we leave this thing just to roll on and kind of get itself right on its own, it will not happen. And I know that there's been a lot of work done at AU level with the assessment of regional integration in Africa. But I think what we need is that discussion that happens at a much more, let's call it local, in the sense that it's regional let's say, for an example, that traders alongside customs and government agencies and private sector will talk from South Africa to those very stakeholders in Mozambique and look at how can we change legislation, how can we fix policy, how can we do those practical things so that the how of regional integration is actually addressed. And I think, the policies are there. It's just that I don't know that we always, our government agencies or our private sector people who have to obey the legislation or face the consequences. But I think often there's this implementation, policy versus implementation gap, and it's only by really addressing it in a really functional, operational way that you can address that how. And I think what is, and as I said, a critical role that corridor institutions play. And I think in East and Southern Africa, East Africa, you have at least some sort of recourse as far as the regional economic community is concerned, whereas in SADC, there is, in my view, a huge challenge with getting member states to implement what's been agreed. And, so that on those levels, that's where I think it has to happen. It's not just one simple thing. It's, again, layered from the local sort of smaller regional level right through into the sort of regional economic community level. I don't know that that answers your question, Washington, but that's the best I can do. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that. And you've implicitly put some challenges to us as a group as well. So this is certainly something that we will reflect on as well, the role of the private sector voice. I've really enjoyed your focus on the informal sector, on the informal cross-border traders. Of course, most of them are women, so very, very important. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Shikonde Nsusa, Senior Program Officer, SADC Secretariat, focusing on transport and the Infrastructure Directorate, as I mentioned earlier. Shikonde, thank you so much for joining us. We look very much forward to your presentation on the North-South Corridor. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for welcoming me. As rightly indicated, I'm Shikonde Nsusa. I'm the Senior Program Officer for Transport and the Infrastructure Directorate of the SADC Secretariat. Can I start my presentation now?
Yes, please go ahead, Shikonde.
Okay. I will just share. And please confirm if you're able to see.
We do. Could you put it on presentation mode for us? Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. I have to admit that it's my first time to join this. And I think it's great to talk to the private sector and also get some feedback from you. Also to share some of the plans. I know maybe there have been some presentations done previously, but I also thought we can get another dimension of the presentation from the SADC Secretariat, where we are now looking at a more holistic picture of having the smart corridors and economic corridors. And I'm going to talk about the North-South corridor in this case. Just some background that for the North-South corridor, we have had several studies from different donors, different partners who had an overall look at the corridors that we have within SADC. And from there, they recommended that the North-South corridor, if we invest in the North-South corridor, we are going to open up almost the whole SADC region. So what I'm going to share with you is a result of several of the studies and also some of the recent assessments that we have had so far. When we are talking about having an economic corridor, we are looking at the concept of having the corridor being a development planning and programming tool for industrialization, agriculture, agro-processing, mining, and other activities. This also, I think, talks to what Barbara was presenting. She touched, I noted, even though I joined late, but I noticed that she touched on improving livelihood of the people who are residing or the communities along the corridors. So we want to make sure that the corridors don't just serve as connecting points from one point to another, but also making sure that the communities around the corridors are benefiting from the corridor itself. We have 18 corridors within SADC, but 9 of those corridors are considered to be critical and strategic. And these are the North-South, Central, Dar es Salaam, Nacala, Beira, Maputo, Transkarahari, Walvis Bay, Ndola, Lubumbashi, and Lobito. Of these, the North-South corridor is considered to be the backbone because it connects 8 corridors, 8 member states, and also caters for 50% of the SADC population and carries 60% of the regional trade by volume. At the end of the day, any investments that would improve the North-South corridor would benefit all the member states within the SADC region. From the picture on the right, you can see the lines in red, that is the North-South corridor, and you can see how it interconnects with the rest of the corridors within the region. We have several challenges within the corridor, from lack of effective coordination, border management systems, infrastructure bottlenecks, but also inadequate skills to implement the interventions that are in the respective sectors. Beyond all this, we also have safety and security concerns. I think most of you can relate to the pictures that are shown here, especially the one on the right bottom side, that's Kasumbalesa, and that really is not a pleasant sight to most travelers on the corridor. Yet we note that there's huge potential if we just concentrate on the North-South corridor. As you see in the pictures that are presented here, most of the main capitals within the SADC region lie on the North-South corridor, but even the major centers for manufacturing. We also have the Southern Africa power pool grid that is mainly concentrated on the North-South corridor, including the ICT networks. The backbone of the ICT networks also lie on the North-South corridor. When we also look at trade flows, most of the commodities that are being promoted within the SADC region, like wheat, cotton, and soya beans, the main flows, the trade flows, are on the North-South corridor as well. Beyond all that, we also notice that we have a lot of minerals in the region. Just to show here that the contribution of the SADC region only, in some cases even on the Africa market, is 100%. I think you can see some of those that are highlighted in red, how they are contributing to the global markets and to the Africa market, which just emphasizes the huge potential that we have. And recently, there's been a lot of interest to develop EVs within the region. And I believe that if we can invest in these sectors, we can also generate a lot of traffic, which can, where now we would need to call on the private sector to come and assist. And we also have leather products within the region. We have Botswana, Zambia, Namibia, who produce a lot of hides. And we have also seen the potentials to have oil refineries. We have the oil extraction. Perhaps if we can have investors in this sector, we can even enhance our economies. These are some of the initiatives that are happening at the moment. They are not fully developed. Some of them are ideas. But for instance, FAO have developed this project, which has not yet commenced, but there are potentials to invest some of these initiatives on the North-South corridor. From here, you can see the potential to have small reservoirs for irrigation and also having irrigation pumps. Farmers can be mobilized to form cooperatives, and if adequate investment is done, they can even improve in terms of their irrigation methodologies. For the same FAO, there's also another area of suggested investment, which is mechanization. And this is just to demonstrate how that can positively impact the livelihoods of some of the communities. Here, as I mentioned earlier, the commodities that are being promoted are cotton, wheat, rice, and soya beans. There's also potential to have agro-processing facilities for both local and export markets. With this, we can significantly reduce post-harvest losses, but also have SMEs develop within the corridor. So at the end of the day, we believe that with all these, if properly coordinated and if we have the right investors coming in, we can really improve the North-South corridor to be a huge engine for economic growth within our SADC region. Just to give some background on the development of smart corridors, there is a program for infrastructure development in Africa, PIDA, which estimated that the losses that we're incurring within the region are about $75 billion per annum. These are due to corridor inefficiencies. And a reduction in these inefficiencies could improve our intra-region and international competitiveness. But this would call for converting the transport corridors into smart corridors. 25 out of 47 corridors in Africa were identified for priority action plan. And out of these, within the SADC region, the North-South corridor was also selected to be a pilot for the smart corridors. And in this intervention, we are looking at this multimodal, multi-country transport corridor with quality infrastructure for interregional and international cargo and passenger facilitated by trade and transport conducive policies and tools. So we had TTFP1, which ended in May 2023. We have now developed the TTFP2, basing on the achievements of TTFP1, where the VLMA, the MCBRT, the CTMS, the TRIPS were all developed under this first phase. Under second phase, we are looking at how can we effectively make sure that all the systems that we developed before are working. So we have 6 result areas. The last 2, 5 and 6, are mainly for management and monitoring, but the main outputs will be coming from results 1 to 4. And from this, Result number 2, which is integrated regional trade, transport, and logistics systems promoted. We want to make sure that these TRIPS, CTMS, and VLMIS are facilitated for deployment and management, and also making sure that all the legal and regulatory frameworks that would support the rollout of the CTMS are properly harmonized by the member states. So in this case, we are going to really depend on requests from different players, different stakeholders, and we are also going to do a gap analysis through a baseline survey where we really want to appreciate what is the current scenario and which areas do we need to concentrate on through a TA service so that we can address particular gaps and make sure that this is working on the ground. I think, as most of you already know, the CTMS was developed during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was designed to facilitate management of safe transit at that time, integrating test and test results and vaccinations electronically. Now we are looking at the CTMS as a way to introduce the smart corridors and smart ports of entry for expedited transportation. Integrating the different platforms that we have in customs, immigration, certification, and all that, just to make sure that it's easier for people transacting and moving along the corridors, not to spend too much time and introduce the efficiencies in the corridor. There are several modules, as I indicated, from trip registration, and most of it is using internet, having an app, whether on your computer or on your mobile phone, depending on the user, whether it's the regulators, the operators, and the drivers as well. This just shows the targeted borders for piloting. I note that not all these are operational at the moment, and that is one of the reasons that we want to, under TTTFP, to have a thorough assessment to see exactly what help is required to make sure that this is operationalized fully. I already talked about the immigration integration, where we can submit e-visas electronically using the system, but also making sure that there is compliance with entry requirements for the different member states. The system is very secure, and it's also cost effective for vehicle tracking solutions. We believe that operators would really welcome this and make sure that they are using it because it's also to their advantage. It would also allow for integration of onboard vehicle tracking devices with the CTMS. In terms of further advantages, the system can be accessed freely by all member states and all users. You just need to register. And there's also the digitalization of the electronic data exchange between the systems and the other procedures. As a way forward for the whole presentation that I have given, and for us as the SADC Secretariat, we are looking at a corridor-wide approach where we want to look at all the inefficiencies and try to iron them out. using the North-South Corridor as a pilot. So the first thing as of now, we want to establish a corridor management institution that would look at all the affairs, and we have GIZ who are interested to assist us to do this. And under Triple TFP, we are setting up a PMU, and we are procuring a technical assistant to help us with all the interventions that I already elaborated. And under the CTMS, under the Triple TFP, we are working already on integrating the CTMS and other customs platforms, tools, and we have some funding from African Development Bank who are assisting us to do this. So in a nutshell, that's what I have to present. I thank you for your attention. Thanks. I welcome any questions that you may have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tikonde. I'm quite sure there will be some comments or questions. So I see Desi already. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon or good evening to all. I've listened and heard all the three presentations. I didn't want to raise a couple of questions a couple of times, but I thought I might actually end up firing away the questions once all the presentations have been done. Chikoni, thank you for this very detailed and brief update and presentation of the North-South Corridor. For me, I just have one very simple basic question, which unfortunately is the backbone of all the challenges we have. In order for the digitalization and the connectivity of the North-South Corridor to be implementable, have the respective member states along the North-South Corridor now signed, ratified, and agreed to implement the MRAs for digitalization, data exchange, and I know the member states like using the word harmonization. I prefer to use the word standardizations of procedures and requirements for the corridor movement. That's my question to you. And then to Barbara, thank you for that presentation. And I've got one, what you might call a radical approach to the informal traders. Instead of us always calling them informal traders, why don't we call them simplified traders and then propose to the respective member states to propose simplified customs regime? Because they operate with a very minimum commercial value. So if they introduce a simplified customs regime or financing regime, then basically they no longer be operating under the radar, but operate in a simplified system where the tax contribution does not have to be like a corporate company. It can even be a symbolic one, like 1% or 2%, but that's a way of empowering the SMEs, and also a way of formalizing them without intimidating them. Has that ever been brought to the table to any either regional or continental body to start thinking of them as simplified traders instead of using the word informal traders? And then the other thing, in terms of access to financing, one of the biggest problems we have of these programs of access to financing is that any financing always have to be through a cooperative. And unfortunately, the reality of Africa is even if you form a cooperative, if you are not politically favored, you will never get that access into financing, because that access to financing comes through a respective member states. I'm not causing any waves, but I'm calling a spade a spade. Now, going to the first presentation of Jaco. Jaco, it was a very detailed, good overview of the logistics. However, I just have one question for you. In order for you to convince, and I'm a freight forwarder, so in order for you to convince the freight forwarders to go back to the rail concept, have you brought into your study the cost comparison of the current rail structure versus the road structure? Because remember, the road structure or road support system gives you a door-to-door delivery, while the rail structure, you still have the last mile additional logistic costs. And one of the reasons why most of the traders, freight forwarders, etc., have actually moved away from rail to road is actually because the rail cost is actually more expensive for the last mile delivery inclusive than the road thing, besides the inefficiency, delays, and unreliability of that? So those are my 3 questions, and I rest it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Desi, for those questions. Shikonde, can we start with you to address the question that he posed for you first? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the question. I would first indicate that you asked about whether the member states have finally agreed or signed the agreements. We are going to table, we have a TTF summit, the tripartite summit in February 2026, and we are going to table the 2 agreements, the VLMA and the MCBRT at the summit for their endorsement. So once the heads of states, the heads of states endorse the instrument, they should now be ready for them to start signing. I know we cannot force them, but we are going to encourage them, and that's why we have the TA service, where we want to work with them to look at which areas do they need support. For some of them, they need to, or they don't have the expertise to draft bills, for instance. So some of our the experts that we are going to employ would be legal experts who can assist them to draft the bills. Where they just need some other technical expertise, they will have to motivate that to us, and we are going to get the required expertise. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that they are able to domesticate these instruments. And once they domesticate, then it means that they will be able to use them as appropriate. So that's what I can say for now. And all this is in an effort to make sure that the member states really are using these agreements that they are supposed to sign. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shikonde. Barbara, could I come to you to answer the question Desi posed?
Yes, sure. So the first question around the simplified trade is being referred as simplified rather than informal. I think it's brilliant. The only problem I see is that there could be, in certain situations, traders who are illiterate and who may struggle with paperwork even if there is to be only 1% tax. But Desi, I think it's a brilliant suggestion. And I think what's valuable about it is that it could be a sort of precursor to formalization of the business should it grow sufficiently, because the benefits of a more formal business are simplified processes to access funding and so on. Although that's your second question, is the financing available only through co-ops? Unfortunately, I have very little experience of that. And I'm hoping somebody much smarter than me on the call, on the webinar, can pitch in and help me with that answer. Sorry, Desi, but it's a great question. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Barbara. We'll park that question. But Jacob, could we come to you to answer the question that Desi posed to you? Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And Desi, you are spot on. I think it's very important that the drive between this modal shift from road to rail coincides with the drive of freight villages and intermodal facilities. And that's very important. We can see it in our space in the southern area. We can see it in the space as well in the central and eastern area, is that we do not have enough of the intermodal facilities. That's most definitely the world's best practice. It's most definitely the way of the developed world, is that you can't have a proper rail migration and the need for the intermodal facilities or shift without the intermodal facilities. And that's very important. You are spot on. So the drive must coincide with that as well. I hope that answered. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jacob, for that. Colleagues, just taking a look at the time, I'm going to now hand over to Nico for closing remarks. And perhaps, Nico, you could offer some comments on the unanswered question. But thank you so much for making our closing remarks this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Trudy. I think off the bat, I think it was a very interesting dialogue with a lot of interesting comments, and I think, as was put by Desi, I think some interesting questions that was left unanswered, and in the short space of time, probably I should not make a comment on that, but rather stick to the closing comments, but I will touch on that briefly. I think today's dialogue made clear that the strengthening of regional competitiveness will depend on our ability to integrate smart corridors, and I will come back to that, revitalize rail, reduce logistics costs, and address long-standing structural changes from fragmented planning and environmental impacts to the realities of informal trade and employment needs. I think that summarized to me Jacob's presentation to a certain extent. But as we move forward, I think the real opportunity lies in turning major projects underway and the insights shared today into a coherent, efficient, and inclusive logistics ecosystem that builds confidence, unlocks growth, and position our region for a more resilient economic future. And I think that speaks to my question that I had in terms of the who are we really competing with. And I think, Barbara, your comments in terms of the layered structure makes perfect sense. There's still a lot to do, but I think we should keep in mind the end goal, and maybe that could accelerate the discussions that we need to bring to the table. In terms of the last presentation, I think this reminds us that the transitioning the North-South corridor into a true smart corridor is not just about the systems or infrastructure, but about creating a seamless, predictable, and inclusive trade ecosystem. Then I want to echo, I think, the very valid point raised by Desi, that empowering informal traders through, I believe, upskilling and simplified low burden processes is essential if our corridors are to become truly inclusive, efficient, and regionally competitive. The transition from an informal to a simplified trader, I think, should begin by creating, as Desi also correctly alluded to, a low burden entry pathways, simpler registration, minimal documentation, no tax thresholds, basic training, and a trusted trader style facilitation, so that participation becomes easier, safer, and more rewarding than staying informal. And I think that is a very good point that was raised by Desi at that. I think just as a last thought, and we often refer to single windows and we refer to smart corridors, and I would just like to leave a last note on that to say that single windows help us talk to each other, while smart corridors will help us to move together. And I think that would be my closing. Thank you very much, Trudy.
Thank you so much, Nico. It just remains for me to wrap up this session, colleagues, which is also our last for the year. I think it's an extremely important agenda that we've covered, which takes us seamlessly into our agenda for next year. And we look very much forward to picking up a lot of these conversations. I'd like to thank our three presenters who've really broadened our scope of thinking, but also taken a look at the linkages among the various streams of this very important trade integration, logistics support, ecosystem development agenda, which can truly facilitate cross-border linkages and trade, but also improve our competitiveness. We look very much forward to working on all of these issues next year, and just once again, wishing you all the best for a wonderful, safe, and very happy festive season, and look forward to see you next year. Thanks so much, everybody. Good night.
Thank